Maybe it's just me, but the Western Cape here in South Africa seems to be getting more and more impatient with the national government lately. Not only has talk of secession become a mainstream discussion in the province, even if the legacy media wants to pretend otherwise, but recently the Western Cape announced that they'd be unplugging 6 municipalities from the flailing and corrupt Eskom and the overburdened national power grid. This is obviously to circumvent the ANC's abhorrent handling of our energy sector, which has led to 13 years and counting of load shedding. Now, to me, this impatience on the part of the Western Cape is incredibly positive, in part because I think it's an illustration of a growing global pattern trending toward decentralization, the dispersion of power and influence, essentially. Now, because they're chock full of useful idiots, parties like the ANC and the EFF have an ideological stake in condemning even just the idea of private ownership, and have ranted against it for as long as I can remember, especially in the context of land and the country's utilities sector. Like most modern Marxists, this talk is usually hidden beneath the veneer of identity politics, so white monopoly capital is the go-to scapegoat, and the consolidation of power in the hands of the state is floated as the solution. But this sort of pooling of influence and power that is an inevitable result of neo-Marxism is also obviously arse-backwards thinking. I've commented before on the maybe necessity of South Africans having to unplug from the state in every facet of life possible. It's a trend we've already seen. If you have a generator and a private security company, those are two facets of life that the state no longer secures for you. But it's this decentralization of power, this trend toward it, that is a part of the reason why I think that will become a necessity. It's not just because the ANC and South Africa as a whole appear to be finishing the last circle at the bottom of the toilet drain. It's because the only way to stop that trend is to, in some ways, isolate the power currently monopolized by states and massive multinational corporations, while recreating that power and influence on a smaller scale in autonomous hands that can legitimately be held to account. Wannabe one world governments can talk about all the great resets they want, but human organizational evolution looks to be taking us in a different direction. In the last 5 or 6 years alone, we've seen Catalonia's failed bid for independence from Spain, Britain's successful exit from the EU, renewed calls for Scotland and Ireland's exit from the UK, Trump's election of the American middle finger to globalism, Texans' talk of secession as a response to Trump's loss in their last elections, and re-energized calls for the federalization or complete secession of the Western Cape here in South Africa. Heck, even Herman Mashaba and Action SA represent an element of local resistance to the globalist and socialist thinking of the African Union and Pan-Africanist thought leaders. Now, this is a trend that's been long in the making, but as it did with most other facets of existence, COVID really helped to accelerate the process. It did this by highlighting just how big of potential vulnerability global interdependence can be, and how little trust can really be placed in traditionally trustworthy institutions, be it your national news or the World Health Organization. And I honestly don't think that the spread of that impression is going to reverse anytime soon. Faceless experts and distant leaders have been losing influence for decades already. Getting back to the Western Cape, what's simple but very interesting about their measured bid for independence from the country's power providers is that if it works, it potentially represents a modern and future model of resistance against the centralized authoritarianism that we've seen rise across the world, from Washington to Beijing and everywhere in between. You see, while past resistance movements have aimed to make cities and populations ungovernable, putting so much pressure on the state's resources that it has to bend the knee or risk failing, resistance going into the future could well look more like self-governance. Because ultimately self-sufficiency is how you resist the dictates of distant leaders whose own bloated and overstressed bureaucracies prevent them from effectively meeting their mandates. We saw hints of this thinking in the attempt during America's unrest last year, and again recently with the Derek Chauvin trial, when activists and protesters took over residential neighborhoods and attempted to declare them independent zones. Now obviously these actions were taken by anarchists, idiots, and ideologues without a plan and nowhere near enough territory or skill, so they were never going to result in anything resembling a positive change. But beneath the hammer and sickle-eyed idealism and identity politics, the mindset revealed is not far from that of the independence-minded libertarian who shudders at the thought of being ruled by a world government that does not understand nor particularly care about his issues and the issues of those like him. And we see the same trend playing out on other levels and in other facets of life and in business. The strictly career-minded employee of the past who once essentially dedicated his or her life to serving the perpetual growth of a single employer is largely extinct. Career mobility and work-life balance were already the names of the game on the other side of the year 2000, But at this point in time, people want to build their personal brands and become nomadic corporate entities unto themselves. Independent online commentators are outstripping the viewership of dying legacy media entities and broadcasters like CNN and the SABC, forcing them to resort to paywalls or pandering in desperate attempts at staying afloat. And even big tech, which was positioned to usurp the legacy media and dominate in its absence, is feeling the unsustainable pressure of meeting the needs of varied and diverse global audiences. We're in an age where power has been miniaturized, commoditized, and mass-produced, where the man in the street theoretically carries enough influence in his pants pocket to simultaneously organize and coordinate a rebellion on every continent. In short, we're in an age that is growing less and less forgiving to monolithic and slow-moving bureaucracy, even if only because the capacity of the individual to challenge that bureaucracy is fast growing. Geopolitically, this means we're beginning to recognize the multipolarity of the world. No longer will one superpower reign supreme across every inch of the globe. And going into the future, individual nations should likely prioritize self-sufficiency and good relations with their neighbors, just in case international law becomes somewhat less international and international trade inevitably follows suit. Private military companies like BlackRock, Executive Outcomes, and STEP will continue to gain relevance as rapidly shifting theaters of war and combat doctrines call for agile, adaptable forces that are less hindered by political reality than their government competitors. Culturally and politically, we'll more and more see energy, nutrition, and security provision becoming localized, community, and familial responsibilities. The decentralized cryptocurrencies also stand to play a strong role in this overall process. In the long term, the current and predicted decline in global population growth will dovetail with decentralization as digital technology allows human populations to disperse from cramped urban centers. All in all, the future could look dystopian or utopian depending on who you are, where you are, and how the shifts are handled. Also, it matters how declining powers respond to usurpation, and certain fronts of the culture wars indicate that the powers that be prefer not to be challenged. Anyway, guys, if you made it this far, thank you very much for listening. Please like, please subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Cheers.